Welcome everybody to Indivisible TX Lege Live. We are so excited to be with you this Friday, the final Friday of March. And today we are continuing our monthly series that we are calling the Reader Corner series. And this is where a group of organizers within Indivisible TX Lege focus on a particular book for the month. And then we come to you live on Facebook and YouTube to talk about that book. For this particular month, we are super excited because we also have a special guest. Before we introduce our special guest, though, I want to welcome and thank Lauren Ortel, our Indivisible National Organizer and Criminal Justice Huddle Leader. Lauren, thanks for being here. Vanessa McDougall, our Immigration Huddle Leader, and Kirk Pate, one of our Democracy Huddle Leaders. Welcome to all three of y'all. How are y'all doing this Friday?
Great.
Pretty well. Excited to talk about this book.
Yes, everyone have their copy with them, right? Our special guest, which you see on the screen with us here today, is the amazing author, Natalia Sylvester. And Natalia, we are so excited that you're able to join us in our discussion today. We are going to have a small introduction here. I'm jumping to my screen that I have. Sorry, Natalia. Born in Lima, Peru, Natalia Sylvester came to the U.S. at age 4 and grew up in Florida and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. She received a BA in creative writing from the University of Miami and now lives in Austin, Texas. So shout out to Austin. Her work has appeared in various publications, and her first novel, Chasing the Sun, was named the best debut book of 2014 by Latinidad. Her second, Everyone Knows You Go Home, which we're discussing today, won an International Latino Book Award, the 2018 Jesse H. Jones Award for Best Work of Fiction from the Texas Institute of Letters, and it was named a Best Book of 2018 by Real Simple Magazine. Natalia's debut young adult novel, Running, is out now from Clarion Books and HMH. Natalia, thank you so much for being with us. Happy Friday. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here today and to talk to you all. It's a real honor, so thank you.
Well, once again, this is exciting for us, a new layout, a different approach we're taking because we get to speak to the author directly. To start off, I think I'm more than happy to share, and everyone else who read this book, that we highly recommend this book. It was so amazing, the story you crafted that we're going to dig into. And so if you are looking for a great book to read, we highly encourage you picking up this particular book from Natalia and anything else she's written, because it's all amazing. So I'm going to hand off the mic to Kirk, and he's going to start off with our first question.
Oh, okay. So Natalia, one of the things that just generally speaking from my personal standpoint has always intrigued me is that we never really fully know somebody else, whether it's spouse, children, relatives, acquaintances, people we work with, and so we never really fully know them. And sometimes it's because we've never seen them in particular situations that may bring out some special aspect of their character, or they don't self-reveal, and so on. So in the book, I'm sort of intrigued by what the characters don't share with each other, the secrets they hold. And those secrets mean that the other characters in the book don't fully know those people until they reveal their secrets. So, one of those secrets was when Martin, I think, just, comments that about his father not just leaving, that he was actually in prison for killing somebody. And so that was a reveal. And so how do these secrets that the characters hold among them individually affect the pace and the narrative of the story itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm equally intrigued by that idea of secrets, and specifically like just the ways that we don't, like you said, we can't fully understand a person, but I don't think that that means that we can't at least respect their privacy, right? Like, I think sometimes our compassion shouldn't be conditional on a person divulging all their secrets to us. And I think oftentimes, like as is the case with these characters, those secrets are rooted in a place of trauma, and though they're kept out of protection for their loved ones. And so even something as even a question often as simple as why did we come here? I mean, I remember asking my parents this and never really getting quite a straight answer. Or sometimes just kind of getting an answer of like, oh, well, and then just, moving along, or sometimes getting a different version of an answer. And I think over the years, I learned like, okay, so there's a pain there, there's a pain point there. And eventually I had to decide, well, am I going to keep pushing it, or can I just honor the sacrifices they probably made that maybe they won't ever tell me the full extent of them because it's too painful, and they're not trying to, get credit for it. They'd rather just protect their family. So even in the book, not all the characters end up knowing each other's secrets, or if they do, they might not know the full versions, because part of it too is the ways that we remember. Maybe even the ways that two people remember the same experience can have different, very different, it can be very different versions. Like there's actually a memory in the very beginning of the book that Martin has this one idea of it being like a wonderful evening, like a really fun game. And it turns out, from his mom's point of view, it was actually a really horrible evening for her. And to her, it's a source of trauma, right? And she would rather forget it. But she was so invested in making sure and protecting him and making it into something that he could look back on without the same pain that she shared. And so I do think that it's something that's always fascinated me, the ways that memory works, the ways that that silence works. We can carry each other, we can carry silence, and we can still feel it. Like it's not an absence of something. Like it still weighs heavy. People can feel when another person has a secret, when another person maybe has a place they don't want to go, and can we respect that in each other? And it almost, it's a haunting, it kind of reminds me in that sense. And then I realized as I was writing that it's similar to Omar. Like he's a spirit and he's invisible, and he's not always heard by those that he wants, that he wishes could hear him out, but he is still a presence. Even his absence is a force.
Okay, thank you.
Natalia is we hear from authors, talk about the journey of writing a book and just that process and how daunting it is. You've gone through this a couple of times. This was your second time in terms of being published. What really were the things that inspired you to kind of tackle this story, and then also just the way you tackled it?
Oh yeah, this story took me by surprise at every turn. The very literal spark of inspiration is that, I started, the very first page is actually the very first thing I wrote. And so I always knew it would be about Isabel and Martin being married on the Day of the Dead, and then being visited by Omar in the backseat of the car. And Omar is Martin's deceased father, right? And I always knew that would happen. And because it was inspired by this idea that, my husband and I were actually married to the dead. So every once in a while, people would comment like, oh, that's so funny. And when they'd find out our anniversary, and it just, like most writers, it ends up getting your wheels turning, and you start to think like, oh, what if, where would that, what would that be like? And what ended up intriguing me the most, and making me actually finally sit down to write it, was one day I realized, oh, he's coming to visit, and nobody will talk to him. And the only person that will talk to him is Isabel. And so I was just really interested initially in what that relation, what kind of bond would develop between them over the years, over every anniversary. and then of course, I thought I was starting out writing this story about this bond between a newlywed bride and her, deceased father-in-law and his spirit that's visiting. And the more and more I write, I realized, okay, of course I'm writing an immigrant story. And he's crossing over from the world of the dead into the living and finds that he's not welcome in the way he hoped he would be. And, of course it ends up kind of, and I say, of course, because there's times where I think I'm not writing about immigration and I'm still writing about it. Like, there's so many things that I can't help view through that lens because it shaped so much of my life. And I realized the more I wrote, like I was writing about invisibility, and I was writing about those sacrifices I was talking about that people make and that, in some ways you would take to your grave. It was also very influenced by my time living in the Valley when I was young, but also influenced just by my experiences. I think the thing that's always struck me is that the ways that we talk about immigration, on a national level or in what you would call like this mainstream, I don't know, conversation. I say that in quotes because who even knows what that is, right? But there's this tendency for people who aren't immigrants to talk about immigrants as if, they're either people to be defended solely because of what they contribute to this country, or people to be vilified. And in either way, you're not really seeing the full humanity of a person because you're only weighing their worth based on, again, like having to tell a person like they have to prove they belong here by somehow contributing something. And it didn't feel reflective of the experience and the community and the people I knew and loved. And I just, even though the book deals a lot with death and it deals a lot with grief, it's also one that I hoped would be infused with a lot of happiness and joy. And that's really why Omar is so funny to me. Like he's dead, but he's full of life.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm going to hand it off to Vanessa to share, similar to what Kirk did, just a part of the story that was especially meaningful to you. And if you want to kind of share that perspective, and if there's a question for Natalia, feel free to throw that in there as well.
Okay. Well, I love this book. I really enjoyed reading it. Yeah, and there were just so many good characters in it. I loved getting to know them. And yeah, we do see a lot of different. We do see characters, migrate for a lot of different reasons. We see, Marisol and her daughter, and Omar, and it's, yeah. So it's a lot of different, like migration stories. So what effect do you think it has on a person to have to migrate to a new country?
Yeah, so I can only mainly speak from my own experience, and but I do think, and it's funny because it's something I've been only in recent years uncovering. There's been times like recently I'm like talking to my therapist and realizing, oh my God, that's because of that. But at least I've noticed that part of it, yes, is that fear. Like I feel like I grew up having a sense of instability, of even though, I've probably shared this story a few times, but when I was first learning to read, I noticed that the word alien kept coming up in the paperwork that my mom would be writing or working on. And I asked her what it meant. And she said, well, that's us because we're not from here. And I was really surprised by that because I had thought, I'd always thought like, okay, aliens are little green creatures out in outer space.
Yeah.
But it was very much like this first realization of even how language is used to make outsiders of us, that we could be considered so foreign as to not even belong in this world. And there is a sense of, I remember carrying that through. And then in carrying this idea through of like, because I saw the way that my mom would like wait on the mail and always just be really anxious about what's going to happen now, because you could take it. It was never a direct line. Like, it's never go from point A to point B and then there you go. You've navigated the immigration system. Like, it was just always, it felt like she was trying to go through a maze. And I was, 4, 5, 6 still. She didn't tell me these things, but I could tell. I could see it in her face. And there was always a sense of like, we might not be able to stay. And we might, and that to me was shocking, because I didn't remember Peru. So I just thought, so I'm here and this feels like home, but it's not. Mm-hmm. At least it hasn't promised me anything yet. It hasn't fully committed to me, even though we've packed up our whole lives and committed to it. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's always like, what I've noticed is that I think it manifests in such a way that you're always waiting for the floor to be pulled out from under you, even when things are okay. And even when they feel stable, there's always this sense of like, yeah, but when is something that's completely out of my control going to just make it all fall apart? Yeah. And that's not an easy thing to have to carry your whole life. Yeah. And I do like to like, I want to emphasize too, because there, everyone has such different experiences, and I don't mean to misrepresent mine or take up space that I can't take up, because we weren't undocumented, but we also never knew, like, we were just trying to figure it out. Yeah. And as we know, like the way it's worked changes, like even, by administration. So over the years, but at least when I was, this was in the early 90s, when we got here in 88, but that was my experience of it, of just that heavy fear and anxiety that you can't ever really shed completely.
Alex, can I interject something here? Because you answered a question that was actually on my mind also. And so much of the detail in the book is about the ordinary things, or ordinary daily life. But it's within this context of what's hanging over you. And so I'm glad you said and described that feeling, that being in that suspension all the time, trying to lead an ordinary life like any one of us tries to lead. And so there's that tension there that's just, it's the juxtaposition of those things that I'm glad you described it the way you did in answer to Vanessa's question.
Thanks, Kurt. Lauren, you want to share some thoughts you had about the book and maybe a question for Natalia as well?
So I read it a couple years ago when we talked about it in a different book club. So this time I tried listening to it and it worked just as well. So good to know you can consume it in all formats. So I was really moved by how much the characters sacrifice, as you mentioned, for each other, and allow themselves to experience more pain and suffering, just in an attempt to reduce it for their loved ones, which kind of makes me think about how people can do the right thing when there are no good options, which, I think connects to the experience of immigration. And in general, I would say mostly there are no good options, right? And a line that kind of connects to this, sacrificing and taking on more of the pain and suffering on page 282, that she would never forgive him, fine. But Omar knew she would never forgive herself. So, just this thought of like, he was thinking so far ahead about how to protect his wife from more suffering. And so I'm curious, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, the idea of no good options. How do you do the right thing? How do you know what to do when you're faced with these situations?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, right? And I think that's part of why I wrote about it is that sometimes I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think that it's important to bring up the questions. it just has always felt like, and you know, I think there's if I'm remembering correctly, there's also like a line too that just makes a distinction between choices and decisions. And it's always felt to me like, you know, a choice has options and it's agency. Like you have, there's the privilege of being able to say, I would like to do this, and to be okay with that, and things just kind of, you know, go as you would choose. I equate a decision to just, there are moments where you have to make them, and maybe you have no good options, but you just have to make them, because it's the only way to survive. And I've often felt like that's what we lose sight of when we talk about migration, as if it's an easy decision, as if it's an easy choice to make, when a lot of people would rather not leave everything they know and love, and would rather not leave, not knowing if they can ever come back. And even if you can go back, is it really ever the same, right? Because places change, people change. And so I think, I don't know the answer to that, you know. I wish I did. I think it would make things a lot easier, but for a lot of people. But I do think that it's something to keep in mind, that not everyone has that privilege. One of the reason, like one of the things that I started out writing this book is I actually started out thinking of it as a love story. And I knew two things. I knew that Omar loved Elda deeply. I also knew that he'd left her. And so I was really writing to find out what could possibly have made it so that a man who deeply loves his wife leaves her. And it, in a way, it actually mirrored the question I've always had about my own family. It's like, what, you know, how bad did it have to get that we left our home? And it, to me, they were the same questions, just explored in different ways.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciated how you explored that in the story, and it was very moving, what you came up with on how to show, you know, what would make someone who loved their family so much have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
So definitely one of the things I loved about this book, were just, you know, having a Latino family, coming from Latino family, Mexican American family. There are so many things to connect with, and that you reference within the book, just the how the family works together and how they communicate to each other, and then also just the humor around it. And you mentioned how death, you know, is you know, a big part of this book because of the way the characters are interacting with each other. You know, Omar no longer being around, but still very present in this book. And that's something that you know, we see in Latino families. You know, even if they don't have the tradition of celebrating Day of the Dead, you know, there is this, you know, desire to remember the loved ones around you, and to make sure that, you know, all of that stuff is still kept intact, and we pass along those memories of the ones that, you know, have been with us. And so I just love that whole piece of it. And as well, I always find it interesting as I get older, and you know, I'm 38 now, and so, you know, have different life experiences, been married, have 2 kids. And growing up, when you're reading about everybody else's lives, you're reading about a lot of things in history. You know, a lot of the books you're given is 50 years ago, hundreds of years ago, things like that. And what I always love about reading contemporary books is that recognition of just being in the space that I live in right now. And so with immigration stories specifically, you know, there's a lot of immigration stories that, you know, either people read or they watch through television and film. And for me, it's like my parents' generation, or it's my grandparents' generation. And there's definitely some of this where you have these different timelines with it. But seeing this story in a modern space, and then also within a Texas space, was something that was just really nice to be able to connect with. and to be able to see that reflected in this story. And so I love how you did that. And you had mentioned you pulled from different, things from your personal life. But as you write this type of story in such a contemporary setting, what are some of the key things that you like to highlight, or what gets you excited to highlight within weaving in the narrative that you have laid out?
Oh, wow. I love that question. Honestly, the thing that gets me excited about writing a story is usually just like really ordinary moments. And I know that's probably not, I don't know, like for me, that's what's exciting. And I think it's because life really is pretty extraordinary, even in moments that we tend to overlook. And, it was important to me that, that Isabel was someone whose family had been here for generations. Because people we forget how immigration, it reverberates across generations, right? It was important for me to set it in the Valley for so many reasons, but I also thought of the ways that we actually, for me, my experience living in the United States was one of a lot of like moving around. And what was interesting is that while we were trying to get our papers, we couldn't leave, right? So we moved from Florida, we moved to Texas, and then we were always just kind of in this weird pattern of movement, but not beyond this one line that we suddenly lived, within minutes of. And what I realized is that we still carry those borders, wherever we go. Like there's boundaries then that exist even in just the ways that we interact with one another, in places that we won't go, places that we can't go. I've often had, I think it's interesting how you said that it felt like that the ways they communicate, felt familiar, I guess, or, because I've always experienced, this is an interesting thing, a lot of Latinx and Mexican readers will tell me like, oh my God, yeah, it totally felt real, like, all the things they don't talk about and whatever. And yet, like, when I'm talking to readers that aren't in that community, they'll often be like, why didn't they just talk? And I'm like, you don't understand. And so it's just really interesting, right? Just the ways that we all experience, again, like, I guess, like, for me, it's just rooted in how we carry it across generations. Just not only the traumas, but even just the joys. And are we willing to give those joys space too? Because I do think part of the flip side of that fear we've spoken about is that you try to make yourself not necessarily as, like, you try not to call too much attention to yourself. And I felt that a lot of times growing up too, that like, yes, I had to be an honor roll student from kindergarten on, but also don't call too much attention to yourself. It's this very strange, juxtaposition of it. But sorry, going back to your question. Yeah, I think that the ways that manifests in very small moments is what's interesting to me. Like, I think one of the scenes I most had fun writing was just seeing how Eduardo and Isabel and Martin became a family in this really short amount of time, and seeing how even though Eduardo had been through so many really hard things, he's still a teenager that got excited about homecoming, and was trying to get a mom for his girlfriend, and and I think that to me, I guess it's important to see and honor the things that are often overlooked. And that's what I try to do when I write.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm going to hand this off to, I think, Lauren, you have the next question we have in our list here.
So I already know part of the answer to this, but I just love it so much, so I want others to hear about it. So you include various storylines in here, in addition to what's going on with Isabel and Martin. Can you talk about how the stories all connect and how you kept track of the various storylines in the writing process?
Yeah, thank you. So when like I mentioned, when I first started the book, I started with the first page, which means I was starting on Martin and Isabel's wedding day. And I always knew that it would be this story that has dual timelines that interweave. So when I initially started writing it, I would write one chapter in the present moment or the more recent time, and then I would go back in time to the 1980s timeline, which is when Omar and Eldar are first crossing the border into Texas. It became really hard to keep track of because I was literally pulling myself out of their stories as I wrote. Like I would be writing one story and then I would leave it, set it aside and go back in time. And so eventually I kind of just, I abandoned the present moment. And also I realized, because part of it was that as I was writing their present moment, I realized like they had a lot of history that obviously is still living in them today and is still affecting how they communicate and what's happening to them. And if I didn't know their history fully, then I felt like I couldn't be equipped to write their present. And so I really, I abandoned that present timeline and just went back and just figured like, okay, let me just write their past from the beginning up until as recently as I can, and really just learn how they got here. And not just in that literal sense, but like, yeah, how did we get here emotionally? Once I've had that, I went back and started the present moment from its beginning to its end. And then once I had those two, I kind of just looked at them like a braid, and then just started weaving them together. It was really interesting because I really just thought like, hey, well, which scene, which time seems to inform or answer questions that this one brings up. And so it just became this process of weaving them together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, big part of why we started this off, and I always like to give Kirk the huge kudos that he deserves for this idea of having a reader corner within our organizing space, is because we get to dive into these books, but really we get to reflect on how it impacts our work, because we're here trying to, advocate and organize for a better and brighter future in Texas. So I want to hand off to Vanessa for our next question to kind of talk about some elements that connect to our work here at Indivisible TX Lege.
One of the things I loved about the book was that it's very personal. Like you felt like you really got to know all the characters as individuals. But we are I guess a policy advocacy group. And right now we're seeing a lot of demonization of immigrants and asylum seekers, and we're seeing Governor Abbott and a lot of our congressmen trying to make them sound scary or something dangerous. And I guess in Indivisible TX Lege, we're trying to counteract that fear of immigration or of immigrants. And so I just I guess I would I really enjoyed the book for that reason. I don't know, did anyone else have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think one of the questions kind of from that, that whole thing of fear you're talking about, Vanessa, and how we see it manifest itself and how it's used as a weapon, against these communities and against these families. What do you see as some of the important work as you've written these type of stories, Natalia, and how to offset some of that fear, whether it's the policies, the rhetoric, and the experiences people have to endure? Like, what are some of the effective ways you can see organizations like ourselves really offset some of that fear that we see that so many families and individuals have to endure?
Do you mean the fear that immigrants live with, or do you mean the fear that I guess that
The fear that some of our
them.
state and national leaders like to instill about them.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to ask. I think there are two elements of this fear. It's the fear of what the
Or both.
immigrants are experiencing, but then it's also just that fear that's used as a weapon, so that people see immigrants as somebody to fear.
Yeah, and I think that's a really hard thing to tackle, because so much of it is really, how are people living their lives? Are they choosing to fear and hate and believe the lies, right, that are fed mostly and for the benefit of those in power? Like, there's always some other. It's. I mean, those who stoke that fear, they know the reality of it. They know the lies, and so it's really up to us to really learn, like, and make ourselves informed and actually see, like, what's actually happening here. Who gains from these policies? What is it serving? And usually you'll find it's really serving those in power, and it's serving the legacy of white supremacy. And if it makes someone uncomfortable, it's probably because in some ways it's serving them too. They're reaping the benefits of it at the expense of of other families, right, that they've never bothered to see as fully human. And as far as just within the communities, right, of that fear that people live with, I think especially when it comes to advocacy work, I mean, it starts with trust, right? And it starts with like also just learning the history of a place, and learning like even like at the hyper local level, right? When I first came to Austin, I got here in 2010. And I remember I had a few conversations where I would, like you do, you're like, oh, where's the good food and all that. And more than a few people said, oh, you got to go to Hot at a Million. And I was like, okay, cool. And then usually they'd say, but by the way, it's a little sketchy over there. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And we finally went there. And I was just like, oh, they meant people who look like me. I was like, this just looks like home to me. This is what sketchy is, And I was really upset. I was like, eventually I just started like, because I would hear this enough that I just tell people, what do you mean by sketchy? Because it's like, yeah, like, why not just say it out loud, And I think that there's such an, especially in Austin, like, there's such a willingness to erase the history and even just the living history of our Black and Latinx communities and Indigenous communities. And it's, it is also embedded in our history. When you go back and you look at the redlining and you look at the ways that Austin was segregated, it's by design, right? And so it's like, if we don't know that history, then we don't know and we don't know that the actual policies that put that into place, then we can't fully know what it is we're serving in our actions or dismantling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I live in Austin too, and so I'm familiar. So for people who don't live in Austin, there was the 1928 plan that that segregated the city, and apparently in the last 93 years we've never really tried that hard to dismantle it, and so you can still see the effects of it today.
Let me ask a question here, Natalia. Personally, I try to avoid using the word solve, solutions, like solutions to the crisis on the border. And I was thinking again this morning about Joe Biden's press conference, where he says that he basically says, a lot of things simply can't be solved. You just try to improve. You make things better. So on some continuum from most hopeful to somewhat hopeful to not hopeful at all, where's your thinking about the prospects for addressing these kinds of immigration issues? That in one way, the book seems so typical to describe. So how are you feeling about the prospects of making things better?
I think it's two parts. I think that when we do talk about it in terms of solving, then the weird part is that no one actually ever, or at least we so rarely then go back to the real root, right? Of why it's almost it's like blasphemous to me how often the conversation around immigration happens without actually looking at U.S. policy in the countries that people are coming from and having to leave. That's their, it's like, and really fully looking at the U.S.'s complicity in that. And so I think if there were ever going to be this idea of solving, it's taking accountability for that and seeing how do we heal those wounds that we've been responsible for across generations.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the roots issue, because so much of what is attempted is dealing with consequences and not causes. And I don't have a clue personally about how you address root causes in various countries, but I have to imagine that there are many people who immigrate who, if conditions were amenable and good for them, they wouldn't dream of being compelled to leave. I mean, they would want to stay in their home countries. And so I think about the difficulty of addressing root causes in those countries. But since since immigration is a real thing, there is the whole policy question about how do you make it better for those who have immigrated here. And so it's to say it's complex is a gross understatement. But at the same time, I think we have to try to find ways to make it better.
Yeah, I like, Natalia, how you talked about just the complicitness that the United States has in a lot of this dysfunction, and it's really how we look at our country and the role that we've taken in really undermining what other countries can do, and how we are just making things worse in a lot of different ways, and not being held accountable for that. But then at the same time, we have this story of America that we're country of immigrants. We have the Statue of Liberty. We want to welcome people. And it's just interesting how the tone has shifted between welcoming the Europeans coming from the boats and from England and France and Germany and Ireland. And, when they walked in, they got citizenship on day one. They went and joined, whether it's the Civil War or something else that they joined, right off the bat, and how that conversation has changed so much when we look at, Latin America, whether it's from Mexico, Central America, South America, and now it's brown people that are coming to the country and wanting to just continue the cycle that we've seen within the United States so far.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's like everyone likes to talk about the American dream, and the truth is that's only been it came with a lot of conditions, right? And it really it feels a lot of times when you look at the history of our immigration policies that it was like, oh well, we didn't mean people of color. No, we really just, I mean, I'm not laughing, but I'm just like, oh my gosh, if even, there's a chapter in which amnesty is mentioned in the book. And if you actually go back and look at the times in history that this country has offered amnesty to immigrants, it has disproportionately benefited white European immigrants. So the system has always been serving white supremacy, and it's been by design, and I think, sadly, as the shootings in Atlanta have made clear to a lot of people, is that the fact that our first immigration policies were things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, as the name implies, it specifically targeted the Chinese communities in the U.S. and made it illegal for them to gain citizenship. And it also, and I think more recently, I learned about the Page Act too, which specifically targeted Asian women, right? And so it's also tied in together with misogyny and just so many things that, like, they're not just like concepts, they were put into action, right? And it's baked to our system over the years, and it's not something that is easily fixed when there's an unwillingness to even just to dismantle it from the root.
Well, this may be our final question, and I really want to see just if we can reflect a little bit on just the power and the importance of family. One of the hopes that we try to have with advocating for people to read stories, to continue to learn, to continue to grow, is one that we're trying to understand how we can work and improve our human family, right? Because it's all of us on this planet here together, and there's all these different interactions. But specifically with this story, with Mexican and Latino families, family is such a key motivation and source of purpose, and the actions that the characters in this particular story take, and is really reflective in that experience for Mexican and Latino families. And we see in Texas specifically, but in America, we have politicians that promote family values, but are fine with separating children from parents at the border, are fine with separating dreamers from their parents, not providing parents of migrant children benefits, that maybe the child can get, but the parent could benefit as well. So why aren't we taking that perspective with that? In Texas, we pass laws like SB4 that discourage a lot of things, but one of the big things that it discourages is reporting crime, which would actually help protect the family, if they're in danger. And we saw some of that with the story as well, when as soon as the police were seeing, early in the book, Eduardo just leaves, and it's like, brings us to the title of the book. Everyone knows to go home, danger, go home. And so I also don't want to lay this at the feet of just the Republicans, politicians in Texas and America, although they are horrendous. We've seen failures on the Democratic side as well, and people challenging both now the Biden administration, the Obama administration, with policies and solutions that are actually supportive of the family versus it tearing apart. And so I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on how Mexican and Latino families work to keep the family together, and support it in a state and country that is actively trying to tear them apart, break them apart, and beat them down.
Wow, that's a big question. I wish I had this. I wish I had all the answers to that one.
And maybe it's not just the answers, but just like your reflections on that, like as you write in the story, and just all,
Yeah. I think that what's always been really frustrating to me is how we commodify immigrants' pain. And it seems to me that the only time people really want to mostly pay attention to immigrants is when there's perceived to be some sort of crisis, right? And we end up using words like surge at the border, and like these horrible ways of describing what is really just the manifestation of people doing what they can for their families. I think a lot of in 2018 when there was that audio clip of the little girl who was crying for her mom or her parents at the border, and how it just got played over and over and over again. Like there was like 1 week where it was just everywhere on the radio. And I just thought, like, how is it that this is when people start to pay attention to the voices of the families and the children who are coming over here, right? To only listen to their pain. And what if you instead listened to the tenderness of a mom's voice when she's tucking her child into bed, and realized that even if, you know, if we cared enough to protect that joy, maybe we wouldn't have reached that point of crying and of suffering, right? And I think that sadly it has so much to do with who we get to, who this country sees as human, you know. I don't think anyone could even fathom being separated from their child for like 3 minutes at a supermarket if you're an HED, you know. But somehow it's okay that a brown child is separated from their parents for months and possibly forever, because there's so many who will never be reunited. And I know that's not an answer, and I wish I had them. But I guess for me, it's why I write. Again, because it's just not fair that we choose to see only people suffering. And I don't think, if anything, I think we use the word humanized too much to describe people who are marginalized when they're already human. And I think that, if anything, the ones who have to really question their humanity are those who are perpetuating their oppression and their suffering and commodifying it, which our immigration system does, even at a policy level, right? You know, who's benefiting from these prisons?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, just the story that you lay out here in this book is something that hopefully people are able to read and get a little bit more insight, get a little bit more understanding, and maybe have that moment to reflect on what they're doing to perpetuate that. Because like you said earlier in our conversation, you know, the fact that we place this value on the human being and what they provide and that they need to have, and really comes down to like the economic value. Like we need to continue to understand that human beings have intrinsic value. And so how do we continue to focus our work, our solutions, our advocacy, so that we are seeing that, and it's not just elevating the economic value someone brings, but there's an intrinsic value to every human being. This conversation has been fascinating, Natalia. Your book was amazing. We can't thank you enough for taking your time today to join us so that we could ask these questions, have this conversation, reflect. And to your point, we don't all have the answers or the solutions to just, you know, solve this, but the work that's needed and how we can approach the work is really, really important to us getting there. And so I can't thank you enough for your time. I want to open it up to
Thank you so much.
fellow Indivisible TX Lege organizers. There's a final note you want to share or anything before, you know, we leave this conversation?
Just that her next book is also really wonderful, Running. It's a young adult book, and it also connects to our work and advocacy and finding your voice. And I don't know if you're allowed to speak to the newest one that's in the works, but I'm very excited to read it. So you can just add Natalia as one of your authors to follow and just read everything that she comes up with.
Thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate that.
I can't help but place this conversation in the context of a book that we have already read and discussed one day recently, and that's Caste. I'd really be interested one of these days to hear your thoughts about placing within that framework what you're thinking and what you're writing. And I can't help get past this notion about a point that Cast makes, and that is that it boils down to looking at people's physical characteristics as a means of discriminating between them. It doesn't look inside people, it looks at their outside. And so anyhow, one of these days, there may be, I hope there's an opportunity to talk about your works within the framework of Cast, because it's such a powerful construct. You mentioned the power seeking that's involved. Well, that's very much a Cast, an aspect of Cast. Anyhow, I just thought I'd throw that in because it's been interesting to me how these books that we're reading start to come together and overlap in really powerful ways. And you mentioned about it being in Texas history. I'm not sure if some of the others have yet read A Big Wonderful Thing by Stephen Harrigan. That history is published in 2019. That history never, I don't think, uses the word racism or caste one time, but the description, you mentioned indigenous people and what their experiences have been. I mean, these books in a powerful way start to overlap, including what you write. Anyhow, it's just a thought.
Thank you.
Vanessa, any final thoughts? Not to put you on the spot, sorry.
No, not at all. But yeah, well, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And this was really interesting. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I think we all learned a lot.
Thank you all, and thank you for your thoughtful questions. I really appreciated it.
Well, thank you once again, everybody who watched it. Lydia Ozuna, we saw your note. She's one of the lead organizers for TAG. And Lydia, made a comment that this conversation means so much hearing this. So thank you, Lydia, for that comment. Anybody else who watches this, whether it was live or after the fact, if you have any questions or any thoughts, feel free to put them in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. We love to continue to keep this conversation going. And at the minimum, we are asking for you to pick up this book and read it because it truly is great. Thank you once again, panel. Thank you, Natalia. We hope you have a great rest of your Friday.
You too. Thank you.
Take care.